Okay, well, it's 11:03, so places, everybody, places! Let's get this started.
Thank you, places.
Yes. All right. Welcome, everybody, to The Show Must Go On, Lessons from Theater to Muse Tech in a COVID-19 World. We're going to be going through a little plan of what we're going to do, we'll get this thing rolling. First deal is, all right. This is a session in 3 acts, right? The first act is going to be speaker introductions. We're going to introduce each other, short background on why we're here and why we're talking about this. Then we're going to do some rapid fire sort of improv discussion around a bunch of themes. You will be voting in a poll on what theme you want us to discuss and talk about of the 5, and then we'll stop at about 10 minutes in and rinse, repeat, do another one until we go through all the themes that we talk about. And then at the end, we're going to talk about a few successful examples of what kinds of lessons a theater can have for Muse Tech, particularly as it relates to virtual engagement in a variety of platforms, whether it be social media or email or website or Zoom or whatever. And we also have a resource guide that we're going to be providing in the chat at that point. So with let's just move right along. My name is Max Evjen. I'm not going to read through all this stuff. Just know that I have a lot of experience in theater and a lot of experience in museums, and I've been talking about theater and museums at MCN a lot in a lot of ways. So that's why I'm here, and that's why I got this group of people together, because there's a lot about theater and museums that have in common, and a lot of things that we can be sharing among each other. And I will say that I live and work, and Brad also lives and works on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples. And so I would like to just extend everybody's invitation to learn more about their the land that they work and reside on, which is has either been ceded or stolen, mostly stolen. So we'll move on to Alli.
Hi, everyone. My name's Alli Hartley Kong. I am a museum educator and a digital strategist. In my last museum job, I currently work for an agency, but in my previous museum job, I worked at a historic site where we were experimenting and collaborating with local theaters. I've been a theater person for way longer than I have been a museum person. I've been a lifelong community theater volunteer, stage manager, prop designer, and in addition to my community theater experience, I'm also a professionally produced playwright, and I came in through playwriting through National History Day. Was kind of my first foray into writing for stage performance, and I started with museum theater and have now gone on to write for theater projects throughout the country, and I've had plays produced internationally, including several virtual productions during the pandemic. And Sarah and I are both coming from stolen Munsee Lenape land. We both live in New Jersey.
All right, and good morning, peace and blessings. My name is Richard Josey. Greetings from Newport News, Virginia. Before anything else, I want to acknowledge and speaking from the traditional land of the Powhatan, and want to honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who've stewarded it throughout the generations. Um, I've been in the museum field for a little over 25 years. I think I'm pushing on 30 now, and my entry into the museums was through theater. So when I was 10, they started a sort of program for African American children when Colonial Williamsburg was beginning to start talking about African American history, and so I ended up being one of those 10-year-olds that came in, and that's how in that process, that's where we were doing theatrical pieces and being directed, and oddly enough, I was also doing it in high school as well, and so my whole career has been built up off of the power of character interpretations and believability, and many of the things I'm going to talk about today. Doing a lot of facilitation work now, but everything that I do these days is just trying to help people craft the lens of diversity and a practice of inclusion.
That's great. I actually could just sit and listen to everyone's backgrounds forever. I am grateful to be part of this group. My name is Brad Dunn. I began my career in theater actually as a sound engineer, and realized that though I had lots of opportunity lined up, I was going to spend the rest of my life with a wardrobe of nothing but black pants and black t-shirts, and kind of stuck in the back of the theater. And I was getting in trouble a lot because I was attempting to kind of like find my way hanging around like the writers, directors. I wanted to learn more about the storytelling piece. And so kind of flipped my career around. The degree in journalism led me into filmmaking and doing interactive design, and spent a lot of time in design agencies, small agencies, did some advertising work. And being a resident of Chicago, I decided what I would do in theater is I would start improvising. So I spent many years going through conservatory at Second City and at classes at IO Chicago, and I improvised at IO for many years, and then decided what I really wanted to do was direct. So I've been doing interactive and working in game design and social media and digital content by day, and directing theater in Chicago for a number of years. And I found my way into museums. I'd had some museum clients, and I found that actually the work that I do at museums is the most perfect fit for all of the things that I've done in the past, whether it's storytelling through directing, working with actors on stage, to designing game engagements and game-like experiences for clients, doing interactive work. It sort of all has coalesced at my time at the Field Museum. I don't know if I mentioned that. I'm at the Field Museum in Chicago. I'm the web and digital engagement director. And I think with that, I'll pass the baton.
Great, thanks, Brad. Again, I'm Sarah, and thanks to Alli on the acknowledgement of being on Mansi Lenape land. I also want to add to that a shout out to one of my close friends and colleagues, Crystal Echohawk, and the folks at Illuminative, who, given the content that we're talking about today, are really working to change the depiction of and involvement of Native and Indigenous folks in popular culture, media, and messaging. So I think that's an appropriate place to direct you now. I'll also tell you that, yes, my background in love is theater. It has the first place in my heart, even beyond museums. I first appeared as Heidi in a tour of nursing homes around Northeast Pennsylvania. And that led to a kind of long trajectory of being on stage and off. My most favorite kind of work that I do is based in live interpretation in theater in museum spaces. That work has led through my consulting firm of Dialogic Consulting to new opportunities doing script writing for gaming, as well. That understanding of dialogue and human connection, I think, informs tech really well. I'm thrilled to talk more about my experiences and share some stuff with you across the course of the next few minutes.
Okay. All right, so these are the 5 themes that we're going to be talking about. So we're going to right now go ahead and release the first poll for everybody. And you're going to go ahead and you're going to pick whichever one of these you want us to cover, to talk about right now. So you're actually directing this session right now. So go ahead. We have the different themes are intentionality for exchange for a wide diversity of audiences, dismantling oppression, extending grace, tell a story silly, or suspending disbelief. So please go ahead and fill out the poll, and we look forward to doing things upon your direction. Okay, and whenever the results of the poll can be, okay, looking like we have intentionality for exchange for a wide diversity. So I will select Richard and Sarah to start off.
Awesome. This is that moment where typically you're on stage, you can make eye contact with someone and say, you, me, which is a little harder to do right now. But I'll say, one of the things that I think about when I examine the concept of technology theater and kind of the diverse learning styles and the opportunities that are opened up there is that I'm really particularly vested in museum tech that recreates kind of that feeling of community that we get on stage in theater, right? And I think for a long time, much of our museum tech was, at least from my role as a curator and as a museum interpreter, was really geared towards individualizing the experience, right? Coming out of that kind of 1990s visitor services approach, right? Where we said everyone has to be able to choose their own experience and engage in the way that they see fit, which in theory is great in terms of diverse audience engagement. The challenge for that, and where I think about the possibilities of theater, is that those individualized experiences are kind of cutting off our nose to spite our face, right? Museums are intended to be communal experiences. They're intended to have that space much like a theater, right? Where we're pulling and building from the energies of the audience. And yet there's so much design that is literally, right, facing walls, right? I mean, we are building interactives and interactive elements that are not only individualized, but in the way that they're incorporated into exhibit design, direct our attention away from each other and our physical body language towards, kind of walls, screens, blocks, right, to our engagement. In theater, we call it cheating out, right? This idea of kind of turning your body and working and exposing yourself directly to not only the other actors you're working with, but to the audience as well. And I'm really vested in not only the physical manifestation, right, of community-based tech interactives in museums, but then also within their design in and of itself.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and that's where I was gonna really go, was it was in the design. Because I remember, when we were when I was at Colonial Williamsburg, and we were coming up with what we call the Revolutionary City, and we took the early 1700s up until after the Revolutionary War, and we began to stage a series of chronological series of skits, on the street. And then staged areas. And one of the things, and again, this was, in the mid 2000s, and one of the things that I'm really considering now as I think about intentionality is, we produce these pieces, and the question that we never ask ourselves is, to what end? That, in many cases, it's, it oftentimes stops at the level of, something that's entertaining and something that we think is going to be thought provoking, but we never take the time to think about how real change happens within individuals and within groups. And so what I would do differently now is I would be very intentional in the timing and thinking about, okay, yes, it's a 10-minute scene. The scripting and the placing and the directing and everything that we do, regarding this scene is not only grounded in historical fact. It has a rich texture of nuance incorporated, so that a conversation afterwards allows the audience to not only come out of seeing something that's very entertaining and thought-provoking, but it's also something that becomes relative to the lives that they're going to have to enter into afterwards. With that, I also think that their intentionality, our intentionality is limited by our focus. And I think oftentimes we overlook, mental health, for example, and how we think about, how these conversations may happen. And so I'm just thinking about when someone goes to see something and it can be traumatizing and it can be triggering, that we've also got to start to incorporate helping people out of that moment that they were in. And what do you do now? We've just triggered you, and now we're just going to let you go back into the world triggered. Like, we got to figure out how to help people re-engage into the world. And so so there's a couple of things that I'm thinking about in terms of intentionality, for me, and many of the things that you'll hear me say today. It all boils down to this key question. And Sarah, I'm gonna say it. What kind of ancestor will we be? When it's all said and done, when we've done our thing, what do we want to be known for?
Yeah, I think it's interesting also to hear you talk about, Richard, this idea of, change, right? What is the impact? What is the change that you want to see in this work? And I think a lot about that with theater too, because, we know a lot of things about how people move forward to create behavioral change right now that maybe we hadn't as a field examined across decades, right? And you and I have talked about, one of the things we know is that this sweet spot of getting people to move forward is this space of exposing them to new content, right, as one piece of it, and giving new information. The idea that we are kind of poking and prodding empathy and emotion, right? That we're building emotional connection. And that third piece is literally the invitation to do something different with that learning, right? And so that triangle, we optimize our chances of moving people forward in behavioral shift as evenly as we can look at those three concepts of that triangle. And so when I think about change in theater, right, or change in tech, it is that gap of what do we do next, right? What's that invite? And that's what I'm curious to explore.
Got you. And I'll say one last thing, Max, and that is an acknowledgement of the fact that as much as I come to this with an eye and a desire towards how does it create, change, the one thing that I want to make sure that I put on the table is that sometimes, and as we're seeing now in our current circumstance, sometimes that just a mere distraction is enough to provide change. So sometimes it's not about intentionality in terms of, okay, we want you to leave this and go change the world. Sometimes it's about, we just want you to have a moment to breathe so you can think. And I think that's super important, especially at this point in time. And I want to be clear about that.
Excellent, excellent. And I'll just add, in terms of like things that we maybe weren't intentional about, but doing this conference last night, we had some karaoke that, because we could all choose what songs we wanted to do, that was the first multilingual karaoke that we ever had. So when you talk about virtual engagement and how we can be intentional for these things, well, what about going to where people are? Let's put the next poll up. And now we're going to have you pick of the remaining 4 themes. Just don't pick intentionality this time. So dismantling oppression, extending grace, tell a story silly, or suspending disbelief. And as much as I wanted to be in person karaoke with everybody last night, the advent of multilingual karaoke was amazing. And that might be some lesson for our museum folk as well as our theater folk, right? If we're truly trying to engage people where they are, oh, here we go. Okay, dismantling oppression is next. All right, who would like to tag in for dismantling oppression? Let's do Alli and Brad.
Sure. Yeah, I can get us started with in some of our planning sessions and thinking about when you're engaging artists that may not have the traditional museum background or the traditional content production background, you're opening yourself up for a whole range of interpretations and bringing in a multiplicity of voices into our production as museum producers that you previously haven't had that opportunity for. So that was kind of the first lens in which you can really approach this. And partnering with artists, I've always found, particularly for me coming out of creating museum theater pieces in pretty conservative institutions in pretty conservative places, has really given an opportunity to open up dialogue, because empowering artists to come in and present a different point of view opens up a conversation in a way that is less threatening to some of our audiences. Whether it should be like that is another question, but from my own experience, I've found that that audiences, when they're, and especially in historic sites, when you're presenting an artistic interpretation, it opens up the dialogue in a different way, which can lead to you creating these reflective opportunities, because you're, as an audience and as participants, you've all gone through an artistic experience together, so then you're reflecting on it together, and so that is a way that can open up conversations that can lead to some of these greater issues.
Yeah, and so I'll also clarify that this is an area where I don't have a ton of experience, but in true spirit of improv, I'm never going to leave someone hanging on stage. So I'm always going to jump in and try to support. So I'm going to talk. I can talk a little bit about what's going on at the Field Museum right now, and I'm not in the center of that experience, but it is affecting. We are trying to affect the process, which is right now we're in the middle of redoing our Native North American Hall. And we have, I think the museum has done some really interesting work here in that they've created an advisory council of Native people, scholars, members of the community, many artists from all walks of life. And it's from all over North America, so Canada and the US. And I think the larger group that's seen materials, that's reviewing a part of the process is like over 70. But there's 14 that are sort of a core that before the pandemic were coming into the museum. And so one of the things we're balancing right now, they're working mostly with exhibitions, and we've hired a number of Native staff that are helping us through the process. And literally just before the session, I was in a meeting where we're working through our process for how we're going to surface Native voices and make sure that we're not the museum speaking on behalf, but that we actually, the approach we want to take for the show is to actually ensure that it is the voices of Native people telling their own story, and that they are still a thriving community with all they've been through. They are also not monolithic. And so one of the things we are trying to do right now is find ways to have workflows that surface these artist stories, that surface the work of the conservators, the preparators, both in the work they're doing on the show and then their lived experience in their lives, and not be, and like literally for me, a white person speaking for them, but even the museum not being the people speaking for them. And then also, how do we, which is kind of what you were sort of alluding to, Alli, just sort of like, how do we also balance that with reaching our audience and reaching our audience in ways that open them up to what for many of them will be new ideas, that the idea of being an anti-racist is not to waste time with the guilt of things of past, but to proactively work forward towards changing the trajectory of things in the future. And so how do we bring people along for those narratives and those stories? How do we sort of decolonize the museum in this process in a way that's not just show and not just blog posts or posts in social media, but is actually that the process behind actually reflects an effort to undo the processes of the past, the way the museum approached the show, say literally 50 years ago. And so I'm always struck by the balancing act that we're trying to play there. And even for us on the digital team, trying to ensure that we are taking an approach that decolonizes all of our content and all of the work that we're doing, so that we're telling an honest story to the public, which is often a new story for many of them.
I just want to kind of tag in there within like the idea of multiple voices within theater. Documentary theater is a genre. Some of you may be familiar with Anna Devere Smith, who played Nancy on The West Wing, but is also an incredibly accomplished documentary theater producer and playwright. So I feel like documentary theater is a genre from the world of theater that pulls voices, and some of you may be familiar with the Laramie Project as well, too. That's another pretty famous example of documentary theater. And in documentary theater, it's adding a storytelling approach. There's a play version of with the Prop 8 hearings in California in 2008. There was a decision made that there would be no filming in the courthouse. So a theater group adapted the testimony into a script from there. And by using the actual lived experiences of people and using their words, theater was a vehicle to amplify these words and to take something like a courtroom proceeding could seem really dry, but the way that the playwrights worked with the individuals who are telling their stories to really craft that narrative makes it a really compelling piece of theater that that is telling this really important historical story and centering the voices. So I mean, that's one way that theater can work to do that. And I know that has nothing to do with museums, but it has everything to do with why we all came into museums.
Okay, great. And let's do the next poll. So you all can choose from the remaining three: extending grace, tell a story silly, or suspending disbelief. So go ahead and choose those. I'll just add that when we're giving a resource guide later, there's an example from theater, the We See You WAT movement, which is We See You White American Theater, a list of demands from BIPOC peoples to say, we see your boards, we see the way you hire designers, we see the way that you hire actors, we see like all of these things that are oppressive, you know, and I think that list can easily be translated to museums. We see the way that you curate your exhibitions, we see the way you design your education programs, we see like all this, we see your boards, right? we see how that all happens. Okay, tell a story silly. All right, so we'll do that. All right, I'm going to jump into that one. And who would like to jump in with me? Well, I'll just start off by saying that theaters and museums benefit both by telling stories. And another thing that we end up putting into the resource guide is one of the blog posts from Colleen Dillenschneider saying that entertainment is not a dirty word, right? Versus education. That entertainment is actually what drives people to visit these organizations, and education is the thing that justifies the visit. So it's not saying that education is not important, but it's saying that you have to, that the way to get people in, the way to invite them in is through stories, is through these narratives, whether it be documentary style, as Alli was talking about, or just be intentionally looking at stories that you can include from different, from a variety of people, as Brad and Richard were talking about, right? So, and then, you know, figuring out how, like, look at other stories about how you want to approach it. I also put in the resource guide the story spine model, which is just one way of telling the story, but it's one that Pixar uses a lot of, like, first there was this thing, then this happened, this happened, this happened, until one day, boom. And that really, it really tracks on to like every Pixar movie there was that's been released. But it's actually a pretty effective way of telling a story and pretty easy to follow. So that's going to be in the resource document. So Brad. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. I'm reminded here of a book that I read actually just about a year ago, and credit for this goes to Amelia Wong from the Getty. She turned me onto this book, The Storytelling Animal: How Stories Make Us Human. It's a great book if you haven't read it. And I mean, the quick summary, which doesn't do it justice at all, is the idea that people learn through story. The reason that we feel things when we watch movies, the book talks a lot about scientific studies that have been done to see the way that our brains are operating when we're watching a story. The parts of the brain that experience empathy actually light up when we're watching. So that's how we're able to feel the heartbreak, the love, the joy that we see on a screen. This starts to get into research I've been doing purely on my own about, and this kind of gets to the overlap for me between theater and museums, which is what is the experience the audience is having, and what is the experience, like, both at a theater and at a museum. And it's crafting those moments that light up the parts of the brain so that these stories can resonate, can stick, and it opens up pathways for learning. There's a lot of research done in this area about how focusing, I think, as you said at one point, Max, like the sort of emotional piece, rather than like making sure everything's like factual, you know, like the historically, like a perfect timeline. Of course, those things are important, but to teach people critical questioning and critical thinking, it's important for them to sort of like relate to the content through story, because it enables people to personalize it. This book, The Storytelling Animal, and I will admit I hadn't actually thought of this, but that the reason or an element of like using simulators for training, whether it's like literally like a flight simulator, like a pilot learning to fly, or in game design, we used to use simulation as a way of training government employees to learn empathy and learn how to relate to people, work with people, is the idea that that is actually a story. A simulation is the experience of a harmless story. No one dies if that plane goes down. No one gets hurt if someone shows insensitivity in the simulation training, but it is actually the experience of a story that actually helps them learn in a really safe space. And so that's something I've been thinking a lot about as I got into museums. And to me, that's the role that sort of story plays, is it actually facilitates learning.
And Sarah wants to tag in.
Yeah, just two quick thoughts. One of the things that stands out for me about the way that theaters tell stories, right, that we can draw from is the fact that, you know, we talk a lot in our field about relevancy and how do we bridge those moments between a historic past and a contemporary present. And I think, you know, theater has been exploring that for a long time, right, in adapting concepts from, you know, 1870s London to 1940s Chicago, right? And, you know, we change costumes, we change scents, we make the adaptation. And I think that there's some power in that, right? In thinking about that, the fact that the heart of the story is not necessarily involved in the setting and the time period, but is in those human interactions, right? And so it asks us to think about the trappings of tech, right? And all the bells and whistles. I mean, we all have backgrounds that look alike, but who cares, right? In the long term, what this is really about is all of us, right? Interacting and talking with each other. The other thing I would say is, you know, Brad, to your point, I think, you know, and I'll be the first as the director of education at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. And admittedly, in New York City, I had a plethora of folks to choose from in hiring processes. But, you know, not only is it about finding the right story, it's also about getting the right storytellers, right? And frankly, I would hire actors and actresses every day of the week rather than museum professionals or historians, because yeah, they had a lot of information, but actors and actresses know how to memorize a good script. They know how to connect and you know, build empathy amongst audiences, and they bring that piece to life. You know, and I'm not sure what the application of that is purely to tech, other than thinking about hiring and finding your best storytellers, right, as part of the teams when we're crafting these pieces.
Great. We're going to go ahead and do the next poll, but keep talking about this while we do the poll, because I know Alli won't jump in. Richard, you might want to jump in too.
One idea that really connected with all of us in our planning sessions was we talked a lot about the concept of the authenticity of the emotion and the relationship between and especially for me, coming from a traditional historic house museum background, you know, sometimes you either work with people or have volunteers who are like the historical accuracy police, and you know, oh, we can't have a theatrical experience because we don't know for sure that that person said those exact words. And for me, in creating my experiences, it was always very straightforward with the audiences. These are the documents that informed this interpretation, but that we're going for the accuracy of emotion. And I know Richard also worked with some of that, so I'll let him tag in here.
Yeah, and I'll just say, and especially building off of Sarah's point, in that we went through a process where we had, historians or historical-minded people, doing character work, and when we, started this revolutionary city, it was very intentional. We wanted to go to actors, not that historian-minded folks couldn't do the work, but that we were very intentional about the need to intentional about being intentional in the storytellers. And Alli, your point you just made, and I just drew a blank on it, but
well, it's okay.
Yeah,
authenticity of emotion.
Yeah, well, and we can continue
Max,
talking about this too. Yes.
I just wanted to say there's actually some really great conversation in the chat. If people aren't looking, people are sharing some great resources with one another. And so I just wanted to make sure that people knew there's some good things happening there.
Yeah, absolutely. I know Alli showed some of the documentary examples, and Amanda says we stand Colleen, and another awesome theater person, right? Yeah, and but we're going to move on right now to we can still mention some of this stuff, but for time we need to move into suspending disbelief, which I have a couple thoughts about that, but let's start off with Richard and Sarah.
No, actually, Max, I was telling you to go ahead and start off, because
okay.
I want to build off of you.
It's fair enough. All right. So more to that point of what Brad said before, that emotion versus fact situation. Last year's MCN, I did a session with Castle Kim, where we talked about the story spine and talked about like telling stories and had everybody go and tell a story. And it was really fascinating watching all the museum people struggle with the fact that they didn't have to give the accurate information, right? That couldn't happen. And some people really had to struggle with it until they just break through and said, no, you don't have to. You don't have to do that. You just have to tell the story, right? As weird and crazy as it sounds, just get into the method of what happens when you let go of those things, where you actually suspend disbelief for yourself, where you say, maybe this isn't going to be totally factual, but what if this happens? And what if that happens, right? That it allows you to extend what you're thinking into these areas that are going to be inviting to more people and to these wider audiences.
Yeah, one of the best programs, one of the best museum programs that I've gone to, and I know I'm looking in the chat, so I know some of the folks I know some of the folks who are actually here in the session now, was a program that was done. It was putting George Washington on trial as if the Americans had lost the American Revolution. The Americans lose the revolution, George Washington goes on trial. We know that's not fact, but the idea behind the concept being rooted in history and kind of alternative history for the purpose of exploring the history a little deeper, and that was amazing to me. And so when I think about just this sort of idea of creativity, how creative we can be when we don't constrain ourselves so tight that we aren't able to do the types of things like that help people kind of envision something that's different than what they could have possibly thought. Because there's a 90%, 99% chance that anybody who comes to your museum or historic site is going to know something different that they didn't know when they came. And so, let's use all our opportunities to figure out how to help them see that.
Yeah, and I also want to just throw this idea of, suspending disbelief, and we've talked about this a lot in our sessions. It's a great gift, right? That an audience member comes into a theater and they don't look up at me and see like, oh, that's Sarah Pharaon, right? And that, that's my job, is for them to suspend their disbelief, to believe that I am someone else in a different time, in a different space. And that these words that I'm saying are not pre-scripted, that I'm just coming up with them in a regular conversation, right? So audiences suspend their disbelief in our spaces in theater all the time, right? And I only offer that for that moment of, we've talked about the fact that museums don't benefit from that, right? Museums don't have that moment right now. People are vested in authenticity. Is it the real artifact? Was that actually there? Are these the actual words? And so thinking about how we flip that, right? What are the possibilities for that in tech? The last piece I'll say is about that power of breaking the fourth wall, right, that we have in theater. So this concept of suspending disbelief, right, they're in disbelief, and with a simple head turn, like in The Office, the television show, or others, I can add emphasis on that moment of breaking the wall. I only mention it because I think one of the opportunities for us in museums is to do a better job of breaking the wall, right? And of being transparent in those spaces. And it's just a lesson from theater that I think we could gain from.
Yeah, looking at you, science museums.
Well,
Right.
and with the historic houses, people didn't walk into the historic house and like stay behind the ropes and walk on the cleanly marked. Why are we pretending that this is anything but it's what it, but what it is? We, as the behind the scenes people, we know what went into creating this experience. Why are we so dependent on this fallacy of accuracy when we know that nothing can ever be 100% accurate? Why don't we just take that as the way that theater has and use that as a jumping point for creativity?
Okay, well, we can now move on to the last one. We don't need the last poll because we're on the last theme, which is extending grace, which I think a lot of us need during this time of this pandemic and through these virtual channels. So who would like to start with that? Well, I mean, I can start with that. Okay, so I've even heard things at this conference about different things with video production and social media, about how even if it's not the finished product these days, people are just fine to have it, right? People are still accepting and understanding that maybe this isn't like, this doesn't have to be the big produced thing. On the flip side, there's also been instances of people looking at what's in the background, like what does prep for this exhibit look like, right? And you know, that thing, that those moments can be really exciting to people, right? That what does prep for a theater look like? You know, we in the department theater at MSU, we did a digital strategy, and in that saying like, okay, we need to like show the process of production, right? Show how this thing is being built, right? What that means, because a lot of people don't get to see that. Well, same thing with museums. Show the process of building your exhibits. Show show the boring meeting that you're in while you're doing your education goals, right? Like whatever it is, right? Like show people what it means to do museum stuff, right? Show what it means that you're at your computer all the time. Show them the code, right? Show whatever that it looks like in Muse Tech. Be mindful that people want to know really what we all do, and are willing to extend us some grace. So let's extend them some too if they have issues with bandwidth, if they have like literally a bandwidth for zooming into things, if they have issues with getting to a place. There's so many barriers to people just being able to like transport in one way or another, whether it be in person or whether it be virtual. So understand that maybe some people can't get to what you're trying to offer, and try to look at the alternative ways that you can you can figure out what your offerings are, even if it's not tech, even if it's something else. I heard about the Crystal Bridges Museum, like providing food for people, because their food service people were giving people food, right? Because that's what their audiences wanted, right? They didn't really want virtual engagement; they wanted food, right? So figure it out. Figure out when the virtual thing isn't the right thing, right?
Yeah, I think I'll jump in on that. As I was preparing for this and thinking about extending grace, to me, I translated that, Max, for me to be about kind of like user first design, putting audiences first. And then ironically, I think that there's times for us to sort of put a stake in the ground and say, we're going to try this thing and see if this works. But I also think that and I think we all struggle with this, that we want to put so much of our ideas onto the audience. If we design this thing, people will do this. If we do this, people will want to do that. When in fact, it doesn't have to be a hit to our egos to simply let go and realize that sometimes, yes, someone needs to charge the phone. Someone needs a space to manage their upset toddlers in our space. Someone does want to go through and learn something about our Ancient Americas exhibit, but they don't necessarily want to go through whatever 100,000 square feet. It's the longest show that we have, and it takes people so long to get through it. And we waste time, and we fail to extend grace when we expect people to learn in the ways that we want them to learn, or that we expect them to learn. Sometimes less is more, and that can still be a great museum visit. And I think that, being the person who's not the expert in pedagogy here, I think that I always want us to pause when I talk about the sort of like, I think it's important to identify like educational outcomes. I work with our learning team a lot, and I have a huge amount of respect for them, and my wife is a teacher. But I also think there's times to sort of say, this is what we hope people get out of this, but they may not. And there's other things they'll get out of it that's relevant to them that is just as important. And we don't need to sort of push our glasses up our nose at that experience. We can accept that because everyone needs something different. So I love this topic, extend grace to our audiences.
I think in thinking about extending grace to the idea of the back channel is something that's very prominent in the virtual world. It's something that I've been experiencing going through this conference, that, you know, we're in this conference where some of us are tweeting about what's going on. We have the chat, you have listening. And to an extent, that's always been an aspect of museum visitation. No one's going into a museum and saying like, turn off your phone. You can't tweet about this. you can't text a friend about this, but you go into a theater and, you know, the announcement is turn off your phone. But now that theater has moved virtual, back channeling has become an aspect to theater, and, you know, theater is becoming also part of this, I guess, divided attention culture. And I don't think there's anything wrong with divided attention. I'm really excited about the opportunities for divided attention. But I think when I hear the term extend grace, it makes me think a lot about the our asks on attention, and also our changing ideas of what it means to engage and how we can take advantage of this as institutions.
I'll also add, and this is kind of riffing off something Richard started us off with, right, about trauma and self-care, and I almost feel like I'm saying something that's kind of very little in that scope. But, you know, when I think about extending grace, I don't want us to forget the idea of extending grace to ourselves as well, right? As a field, as practitioners. You know, and I think a lot about, I've been on a lot of theater selection committees, right? Which is a group of folks who work with the theater who select the season for the year, right? And I work with a lot of really struggling theaters, and, you know, this idea that kind of pervades that script selection process, where we're like, we're going to do 3 for the audience and 1 for us, right? We're going to do 4 shows this season. 3 of them are Neil Simon moneymakers, right? 1 of them are like old chestnuts that we call in the theater, and then this 1 is going to be the one that's pushing and challenging and revolutionary, and we do it hoping that an audience is going to grab it and love it, right? But that there's also a piece of that is about finding energy and care and enjoyment and challenge for us as practitioners. And I think it's okay for us to be a little selfish, right? I want to be audience-centered 75% of the time, and I want a little bit that's going to keep practitioners pushing and challenging and staying in our field.
Yeah, well, and, you know, museum people are people too.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay, so we're gonna
I
move
just
on.
want to like just extend from that. We are also all people going through a global tragedy and multiple global tragedies and multiple global crises right now. And I think in thinking about any of these topics, it's really important to remember that, and us and the audiences, like we are all having the collective experience of this right now, and it affects us all in different ways, like any collective experience, but it's just important to realize that.
Yeah, that maybe we're even more connected in some ways because of it. Okay, so we're going to talk about a few successful examples of how these museums have been doing this. And then I think Alli is going to be, she's putting in the chat a Google Doc and a PDF as well, I think, or maybe we can access it.
I am attempting to share a PDF in the chat,
yeah.
which is not
We'll
quite as simple as I thought it was. So maybe I will just drop my email if you need the PDF.
Yeah, and we can drop it in Slack too.
I will drop it in Slack as well.
Yeah, so and I think maybe Sarah and Alli, you both have a few examples to start with, and Richard, you as well.
Yeah, I'll just name a few. We can drop them in. Some of the things that I've loved recently that I've seen that have a kind of a virtual or online platform, but also a theatrical component to it. You know, to Alli's point about back channels, I work with companies who recently have kind of been embracing the nostalgia. It's nostalgia for me, right? Now you all know my age, around MTV's like or VH1 pop-up videos, right? This idea of we're going to look at the theatrical production, but we're also going to get all these little comments about, you know, from the tech team, from the actors themselves, little interesting factoids. I think the pop-up video concept has been really fun in terms of being, you know, kind of transparent and that breaking the wall moment, right, within theater that I've enjoyed watching. I will say that I really love a virtual and interactive in Eastern State Penitentiary's Questions in the Age of Mass Incarceration exhibit. They are in the interactive, they're using tech to help people assess their own levels of privilege, right, within the concept of mass incarceration. But what they did, which was genius when I think about concepts of sharing stage and with an audience member, right, and actually putting actors in eye contact with each other, right, they oriented the interactive so that all 4 people were actually looking at each other while they were doing it, and also had the ability to then see each other's, you know, shock moments and response moments, and choose to actually share their responses with other folks who are doing the interactive at the same time. I think that's really effective and builds on the power of theater. And then the last one I'll add is, you know, we talked about dismantling oppression and diverse audiences. And I think one part of that is talking about our audiences as creators. So though it sounds really silly, I've got a almost 12-year-old who is TikTok obsessed. And I really found joy in this concept of TikTok duetting. And if anyone hasn't seen the brief Broadway musical of We're Fighting in a Grocery Store, on TikTok, you definitely need to look at it. It's a quick TikTok piece of We're Fighting in a Grocery Store that's beautiful and embraces every Broadway musical trope you've ever thought of. And then it was quickly duetted from you know, tens of different perspectives of the other things that were in the grocery store, including, you know, the child and the late night worker and the ding dong of the door and a can of soup. And I thought it was kind of genius and fun, and would love to see us kind of infuse the two fields I love in better ways like that.
Okay. Just so you all know, you have the resource guide has been put into the chat from Alli. It's a Google Doc, but you can either ask us for a PDF, you can make a PDF from it, I think too. And we'll drop a PDF into the Slack for everybody. So we do have about 5 minutes for any particular questions that anybody might have. If they want to put it into the Q&A, we can certainly take a look at that. Don't see any questions right now, but you know.
Let me while we're waiting for a question, I have a question for my panelists, which is love this idea of grace. And so does anyone have an example that grace has been extended to them, a way in which grace has been extended to them recently, or in which you've extended to someone else, or you've seen it on your staff or at your museum towards visitors? Something recent. Could be small. That could be a grand gesture.
Yeah, I'll say one thing, and that is, and this may be particular to, you know, some of the organizations that I worked with, because they have a reputation of they have a reputation for their authenticity, right? And so when they begin to move some of their presentations to a virtual platform, you know, I saw a young lady portraying an enslaved woman in her living room. Like the whole background was her living room. And because those and it was interesting, because these organizations have that reputation, the level of grace that the people offered, you know, of not having to be, you know, videotaped on the slave quarters, you know, in that sort of environment, has been very interesting to me. And I've seen that with presentations both at Colonial Williamsburg and George Washington's Mount Vernon.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, that's really nice.
And an example of grace that I've seen is kind of grace around partnerships as well too. I've seen a lot of theaters that are now producing virtual and have now theaters that have now become film companies because they are producing virtual. The idea of partnership with other organizations, I've heard examples of museums that have, or historic sites that have extended their locations as places where filming can happen from theater companies that they were previously not as affiliated with. And I think it kind of like brings home the point that during these times we need each other, and are the ways that we used to think about our work and like kind of silo our work between organizations. We can't do that anymore if we're going to survive this.
I would also add that it's not really either museum or theater specific, but just from a personal point of view, I'm lucky enough to be in a situation in my work where I have colleagues that will go over what has to be done, and there'll be a question of, do you have the bandwidth for that? Right? Acknowledging that there's so much other stuff that we are trying to do and to accomplish, and is this something that I can ask you to do or not? And it's totally fine if not. right?
Yeah.
And that makes a huge difference in a scenario where in some museums I felt like that I would never have been asked of me. So just thinking about like how we relate to each other as people, theater is a very empathetic art form, right? So let's like extend a little empathy toward each other, right?
Yeah.
And extend the empathy toward our visitors and the people who want to experience what the museums have to offer.
I have just a quick 15-second example I'll give, and some of you may have seen this, but in the MCN 2020 Caregivers Slack channel yesterday, Coven made himself very vulnerable and just admitted he was having a terrible day trying to run school for his young child, and also be engaged in the conference and do his job. And just, I think right now it's at 21 replies, people just jumping in and saying, you are not alone. We, like many of us, are going through this together. And it's just sort of nice to be reminded that that's what this community is about, is supporting each other and showing that grace to each other.
Any last thoughts? Because that's almost all the time we have. I want to thank all the presenters, all the presenters here for engaging in this awesome discussion. And I want to thank all of you who attended. If you have any other questions for us, please feel free to reach out to any of us specifically, or reach us in the Slack, which is all the rage now for MCN these days. So thank you, everybody. And we hope that this has been something that can be useful for your practice moving forward.